Last time Washington engaged Tehran in talks, critics argue that diplomatic engagement coincided with a quiet military buildup in the region and that Iran was strategically distracted. From a military doctrine perspective, is there evidence that the negotiations can be used as an operational cover for force positioning? How credible is that claim in the US Iran context?
So what we've seen is that massive military buildups are being used as a way to intimidate and to coerce certain responses within negotiations. So it's rather than the negotiations being used as a cover, it's actually the movement of forces into the region are used to put pressure on the negotiations instead of allowing the diplomatic process to continue. There's a threat hanging over the Iranian head right now, which makes it difficult for negotiations to move forward in good faith.
Okay, so this basically brings me to my next question, and that is that if a state is preparing for kinetic action while publicly pursuing diplomacy that we see right now, and this is something that has happened in the past as well. So, what are the telltale indicators military analysts look for? In the current US posture in the Gulf, are we seeing routine deterrence signaling or signs consistent with pre-conflict positioning?
So it's very difficult to assess what the US is currently doing as routine because US military actions this year have been anything but routine. And so we've seen a lot of unusual activities that we would never have expected the US to carry out. And if you think about what happened in Venezuela earlier this year, that's a prime example. But in the Gulf, we're seeing the movement of forces into the region, which does look like a pre-conflict posturing. And again, it seems to be done for the reason to put pressure on negotiations or to prepare for a conflict that the American people, for example, have said they do not want.
Let's talk about Iran's leadership. So, Iran's leadership often frames itself as having learned lessons from the past US engagements. So, from the assessment that might you have done, how does Tehran interpret previous negotiation phases? Would Iran today be more cautious about talks being used as a strategic misdirection?
So what we know is that there are some clear red lines on the Iranian side. It's clear that they do not want conflict, which is pretty normal. And they have some clear red lines in the negotiations. They want to retain their right to enrich uranium, which is a right guaranteed them under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And they don't want any discussion about missiles or missile technology, nor any conversation about proxies. And that's something that they've made pretty clear, both in statements we've seen they've made to the press, as well as what we've heard from other governments close to the negotiations. So the lessons that we can see that they have learned in the past is that they have wanted some more interlocutors in the negotiating process, because negotiations directly with the US have not led to the results that were intended, because it was the US that had withdrawn from the previous Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, not the Iranians. That deal was working very well, and it was keeping Iran from developing nuclear weapons, which was the point of the negotiations. Similarly, the point of negotiations now is to prevent Iran's development, of nuclear weapons. It is not to prevent them from access to nuclear technology, as long as they are within the confines of their current agreements, and they have agreements to make sure that the technology they have does not get diverted into military purposes. But they have not enabled access for international inspectors, and that is something that needs to resume so that all parties can have trust in the process. There is an international agency set up specifically to monitor these efforts. So while bilateral talks are good and helpful and can reaffirm these agreements, that is not the only way to ensure Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. And that is one of the key issues that we're facing in the region.
So both sides basically do believe in diplomacy, and that brings me to my next question, which is that if diplomacy collapses while military assets are simultaneously positioned in the region, how does that affect Iran's nuclear decision-making? Does visible US force buildup increase deterrence, and could it accelerate Iran's nuclear threshold calculations?
I think we're very worried that what we're seeing now is a push to proliferation. When a country cannot rely on good faith negotiations, when a country cannot rely on diplomatic solutions, it resorts to militarism, it resorts to preparing itself for alternatives. We know that Iran has been on the track at times to develop nuclear weapons. We know it has advanced nuclear technologies and capabilities. That has been clear. It does not have nuclear weapons, though. It is not the country in the region with nuclear weapons. So I think the visible pressure and this militarized pressure is not supporting a negotiated outcome, but instead it is cornering the Iranians into a situation in which they may feel they have no other option. We have to see what will come of the discussions, what will come of the talks, but in the long-term interest, it is in the long-term interest of Iran to find a diplomatic solution and not put itself in a position of conflict.
You're absolutely right. And with the history that Iran has with the conflicts and everything, it is the most sane approach to avoid conflict. So, in a scenario where talks continue publicly but military assets increase privately, what does the escalation ladder look like? At what point Iran interpret buildup as preparation for a strike rather than deterrence?
So what we've already seen an escalation ladder signaled by Donald Trump and by the U.S. administration, and what we've seen is their willingness or their talk, their kind of whispering about a limited strike in order to push Iran to concede and to let go of the red lines it has set out in the negotiations. But without a major campaign, an ongoing and lasting campaign, that escalation, which is the next step in the escalation ladder, it won't work. So what we need to see here, I think, as long as the talks continue, there is an opportunity to de-escalate the situation. As soon as one side just pulls out of the talks or refuses to engage further, that's when we'll see that escalation. We'll see more steps on the escalation ladder, and that could be limited strikes. But considering the military assets in the region, it could go quite far. And that is a huge threat to the Iranian people, and not just the Iranian people, but others in the region, because conflict is never highly localized. Conflict spreads, and there are always casualties. There are refugees. There are people who are seeking safety that have impact on neighboring countries. So it's not good for the region as a whole.
Yes, exactly. It is going to affect the region as a whole. And right now, there are two regions involved when it comes to Iran and US, and that is something that we should take care of. So, if military engagement were to follow a breakdown in talks, how would that reshape regional security architecture, particularly involving Israel, Gulf states, and proxy theaters like Iraq, Syria, or the Red Sea?
I think we're quite worried that it could escalate rapidly. And I think last June, we saw a short intervention, a short military attack initiated by Israel and then followed up with the US on Iran, right? And it ended rapidly. If we see an escalation, is unlikely to end as quickly. And that is a long-term consequence that will have further impact in the region, bringing in others in the Gulf, either into a conflict. But generally what we've seen with these conflicts in the past is that there's a push to choose sides, if you will. And there's already some positioning that we're seeing. So I'd imagine that the conflict may spill over. However, we don't know, and there's still an opportunity to de-escalate. And that's what I think we need to focus our attention on, is the de-escalation in the region and the further negotiation in order to be very focused in this negotiation. It's to limit Iran's capability to produce nuclear weapons. And once that is in place, then we need further discussions to figure out other issues, including addressing missile technology, for which there is an international process. Right? There's a Hague Code of Conduct, which is a process to address missile technology, and that has more actors in it than simply the US and Iran. And I think that would be a safer way to move forward. But it is hard to predict, and I don't want to predict what may happen and how far this conflict could spread. We only know from past experience that it is likely, if there's a prolonged conflict, it is likely that it will not remain localized in Iran, but will have reverberating effect throughout the region and potentially the world.
Now, this brings me to my last question, and that is, given current force deployments and Iran's nuclear advancements, is there greater risk today miscalculation, deliberate escalation, or controlled coercive diplomacy? And who holds the escalation dominance at this point?
Right now, what we're seeing is that the massive assets of the U.S., and the U.S. is the most highly militarized country on the world. It spends more than the next 40 countries combined on its military and on its defense architecture and defense equipment. And the U.S. is relocating that equipment into the region. It is holding Iran at threat. And so right now that is a risk. It's also a risk because we don't know, there's no predictability from the US administration. And it prides itself right now on being unpredictable, which is highly risky, not only in Iran, but actually for the whole world. It's highly risky, the situations that have been ongoing that seem to turn on a whim. So what we have to look for, this unpredictability is the risk, and it is part of the coercive diplomacy. It is in the hands of the U.S. that has the opportunity to stand down. That is the more mature position, to allow the negotiations to continue. And that is my concern right now, that the U.S. chooses not to do so, that instead the U.S., which claimed that Iran's nuclear program was completely eradicated last June, may choose this moment to use this moment as an excuse to attack the country for other reasons not related to the nuclear program in Iran.
Thank you so much, Susi, for your time and for your insights. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
And you as well. Thank you very much.